This channel is brought to you by Table 5, working harder every day for a better world. In this video, we will be discussing the Renaissance social class system. At the end of this video, we will post the questions that were asked and answered throughout the course of the video. Feel free to fill in the answers on your packet because you're getting graded. Please enjoy the video.
The basic social class systems of the Renaissance and the ranks that make up it are the stereotypical customs that you see almost everywhere. The tops of these classes are the nobles, who were rich. They owned lots of land and major businesses. Among them were politicians, officers in the military, royalty, and their advisors. The next class is the merchants. They are wealthy, but not too wealthy businessmen, excluded from the nobles because they were still too new to being rich, and because the merchants often tried to marry in. They were well off, but not at all the way there. They weren't allowed the same privileges as most nobles were. The middlemost class were called skilled workers. The skilled workers weren't rich, but if they played their cards right, they could move up to be a member of the merchant class. Often hard workers who were professionals with a certain skill set, or they were a shop owner. At the bottom of the system were the unskilled workers, or peasants. They had little to no job protection and were only alive because their employer needed them to do manual labor. They could be fired at a whim. Most lived in cities because the ones who lived in rural areas often starved and died from poor crop harvests. The highest group of people in the Renaissance were the nobles. The nobles were rich, with so-called old money, wealth that had been passed down several generations. Many had links with the royal family, mostly the queen. Chivalry was a religiously followed code. Their despise and shunning of the merchant class arose from them constantly trying to marry into the nobles, and because they were new money. Many lived in large manors on even larger estates outside the many cities. Their great income were from mostly owning major businesses passed down through generations. In terms of fashion, they followed other nobles and the royal family, once again mostly the queen, which meant extravagant items that were associated with this area of history. As the high elites of the period, nobles commanded respect of the lower classes.
Who were the people of the middle class? The middle class emerged between the upper class, which were nobles, and lower class, which were peasants and laborers. They weren't nobles, but they definitely had money. This class is made up of the people who are merchants, artisans, and craftsmen, who are generally traders of said craft. Traders generally were people who had a little extra money in their pockets and generally became decently wealthy because of it. People of this class wore some clothes similar to noblemen, but they weren't allowed to wear certain fabrics and have as many layers on their clothing as the upper class. Sumptuary laws stopped them. Their homes typically were dark and cold on the inside and were an in-between of the upper and lower classes, being large but not enormous. Political/social rights that were available to them outnumbered those of the lower class, as usual, and were fewer than the upper class. As in any society, the Renaissance also had a lower or working class. Working class members were generally farmers and workers who lived in small, one-room huts. These people were extremely poor. They were never able to improve their living condition. Their diets consisted of bread, stew, beer, and wine. The reason they didn't drink water was because it tended to make people sick thanks to low sanitation efforts. While upper-class men typically owned several outfits, this class only had one or two sets if they were lucky. Clothing that could be worn in England were restricted by laws called sumptuary laws, which dictates exactly what each class was allowed to wear. As for political rights, they pretty much had nada.
Queen Elizabeth I was the Queen of England between 1558 and 1603. She loved the theater and even had her own theater troupe called the Queen's Men. She also never married. Also, in 1588, Spain planned an attack to take over England. Queen Elizabeth gave a speech to her troops, and England eventually won. This is when England was established as a global powerhouse. After this, she maintained peace within her previously divided countries, and the arts flourished. Men had more power than women. However, the more wealthier enjoyed more power and independence than women from previous generations. Most women from the upper classes only had two options, marriage or cloister. Women needed a dowry, so they had to marry a mortal man, or have cloister, where they married Jesus and became a nun. Once married, women were expected to take care of the home, bear children, and feed their family. Lower class women had to work in the fields or as servants. The men lived more luxurious lifestyles as poets, actors, artists, or even architects.
During the Renaissance, someone's social class had a huge impact on their life. If you had a low social class, you couldn't afford any of the luxuries that the nobles could. Some couldn't even afford a proper meal. Luckily, there was opportunity to change your social status. One could do this by obtaining a higher paying job. Others tried to marry into higher ranked families. Because of this, the nobles tried to separate themselves from the other classes. The unskilled workers were often starving, so they would do anything they could to change their social status.